Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of currently streaming horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews may include mild spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy. I have to say, it's a rare occurrence for most horror films to come off as genuinely shocking. Sure, gory kills and jump scares can be shocking, but the thrill of these are often short-lived and can come off as feeling cheap. Terrified scares are legitimately shocking, given the film's smart blending of genres and storytelling techniques, which makes for a shockingly unpredictable horror haunt. Damien Rugna's 2017 Argentinian horror film Terrified, which is currently streaming on Shudder, is a must for horror fans looking for a fresh take on a classic formula. When a string of strange events occur in a neighborhood in Buenos Aires, a group of doctors specializing in the paranormal and a detective investigate further. Though much like the presence they're investigating, they are not welcome. Terrified's somewhat routine haunting premise is made memorable by its defying typical narrative approach to storytelling. Rugna said in an interview with WeAreDefinitelyAfraidOfTheDark.com that he set up the film as a series of independent stories that collide with one another, so the audience doesn't really know who the protagonist is, and thus won't know which of the characters are truly safe. The classic example of a protagonist fake out being Hitchcock's Psycho, as the protagonist is killed off after the first 30 minutes. Here, most will not be familiar with these actors, and so the tension is even more so, and really does allow this 90-minute film to be one ball of haunted nerves. Watching as all of these narratives intertwine into one another adds not only weight to the film's scares, but creates a sense of community of normal people being invaded by an otherworldly entity. We watch as a man is blamed for his girlfriend's grisly and bizarre death, a neighbor slowly loses his sanity as he's stalked by a towering naked figure each night, and a mother loses her child in a freak accident, only for the child's corpse to return the following day. These shocking events lead to forensic scientist Juano and other paranormal investigators to join forces to attempt to uncover the hell that is unfolding within this neighborhood. Rugna cites that The Exorcist was a big influence for his body of work, and felt as though Argentina needed its own exorcist. And I think that influence is very telling, yet his hellish vision allows it to form its own creative identity. Terrified largely rectifies one of my main gripes with demonic horror, in that there isn't typically a lot of variety in terms of the monster design. What you see is kind of what you get, but the creative team here has crafted not only a variety of monsters, but there are a few instances of excessive jump scares. Given the emotional weight tied to each scare, they're more meaningful and truly terrifying. By having evil take more than one form, it never allows the viewer the reprieve of being complacent in the types of scares they'll be exposed to. Early on, there's an instance where a man investigates a strange knocking sound, only to realize that it isn't coming from his neighbor's house. Rather, his girlfriend's body is levitating in the bathroom, being smashed against the walls by an invisible force. Another entire segment is dedicated to a woman's recently deceased son returning home, and while the body doesn't outright move, muddy footprints and handprints line the home's ceilings. And then there's the naked contortionist hiding under a man's bed. Terrified provides such a plethora of scares and monsters that it never feels overly one-note and genuinely fresh throughout. The film also does a fantastic job of highlighting the phenomena of fear. Fear itself is a plague that characters become stricken with, as these supernatural forces and monsters feed off people's infatuation with this notion of being fearful. At one point, Juano says, "We should pay less attention to these things," referencing the idea that hauntings only worsen as people become more determined to unearth the reasoning for them. The concept of two realities or a multi-dimension of light and dark adds a sci-fi component to the paranormal haunting, though this is introduced near the ending and doesn't really feel as fleshed out as it could have been. And yet this concept also allows for some unique scares that play with characters' perception of reality. It's rare to have a horror film that keeps the viewer guessing as to what new hellish being will present itself next. Often, horror films stick with one or two types of scares, and then that's it. They don't kind of deviate from that much. In Terrified, though, the focus of scenes' scares rotates so that the viewer cannot anticipate what occurs next. The segment with the naked contortionist is frightening, as the man sets up a video camera to record the creature's movements at night. Though as he replays the recording, he sees the creature towers over him in his sleep before scurrying away to hide somewhere else in the house. That being an example of a more kind of jump scare-oriented nature, but literally this being is standing over him and he's trying to figure out where it's hiding in the house. And so I wouldn't say it's action-packed. That scene is much more reliant on something being revealed. There's the monster standing here. It's bended and twisted and contorted its body underneath the bed or this cabinet here and there. Whereas in the next segment, the woman whose son's corpse returns to the house, it's less concerned with big scares, like in-your-face moments, and rather it's a heartbreaking and disturbing long shot of a child's muddied corpse sitting at a dinner table as the investigators try to decide how best to handle this clearly fucked up situation. Now, I refer to these moments as segments, as each of the pacing and types of scares within these scenes are very different, And yet, unlike segments typically in films, they flow very naturally together to form a cohesive narrative that doesn't feel disjointed. And while the scares are great in that regard, and while it doesn't feel disjointed and the scares are top notch, the narrative is perfectly serviceable and introduces an interesting concept, but it's definitely not the highlight of the film. While the scares being tied to characters themselves makes them more memorable, no one character is a real standout. The narrative also does drag at about the middle point, which could have been spent developing its more unique sci-fi supernatural elements, or just giving us an additional scare or two. There's a lot of kind of just police procedural back and forth, which isn't all that interesting or isn't as reflective of the creativity that this entire team is capable of in a lot of ways. So I think that some of the middle part of the narrative could have been better spent. And yet, in spite of these few shortcomings, Terrified, for lack of a better word, terrified me. I found each of the scares, with the exception of the jump scare ending, to be a terrific display of supernatural and cosmic horror that taps into people's personal fears, but also this idea that our literal fear can be feasted upon. The naked contortionist was a towering terror, the boy's corpse heartbreaking and unnerving as I waited for him to move, and the girlfriend levitating in the bathroom, well, that one stopped me from investigating strange sounds I hear within my apartment. I'm not always the biggest demonic horror fan, but here, given the strong variety of well-crafted creatures, I was pleasantly surprised, and more importantly, scared. And overall, the film's strong variety of scares and unique storytelling allows Terrified to serve as a fantastic example of foreign horror. And I highly recommend checking it out, and it is currently streaming on Shudder. And that's going to do it for another episode of Daily Horror Habit. I'll see you guys tomorrow for another horror movie review. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Daily Horror Habit podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service, and follow @Daily Horror Habit on Instagram or @Daily Horror Pod on Twitter.